Hello, in this video we're going to talk about how to troubleshoot the Split SDK. To start, let's look at how do we do a debugging flow for all the SDKs. So first we usually initialize the factory or client with the debugging option enabled. And the debugging option is basically enabling debug and or verbose logging for all the SDK actions. Then we usually use a staging environment split so that we can do a lot of testing without impacting any production environment. Then we call the getTreatment, and of course we have to specify the client ID or the key, and the key has to be unique so that we can search for it afterwards in the Split UI. Now, let's say the treatment is valid that we're getting from the getTreatment call. Then we have to make sure that the thread that's posting the impression has actually run and posted the impression successfully. And that's why we suggest to add a delay of 30 seconds. Then, once we see that thread actually run fine and successfully posted the impression, we need to verify in the Split UI live impression page or tab to see that our impression did indeed show up. Now, if the treatment we're getting is not correct, but we are getting a treatment, for example, we're getting off versus on, and we think we should get on, usually if there is any targeting rule that is applied here, for example, the user has an attribute of country, and if the country equals US, then the user will get on treatment. We just need to verify that we're actually applying that attribute in our code. Without applying the attribute in the code, we will always default to whatever default treatment that's set up in the split. So once we fix that, we do the call treatment again. Now the third option is if the treatment back is control. And the control treatment can happen if the SDK on the client side does not have access to the Split cloud. So obviously we need to make sure that your client network does have access to app.split.io. Another option where the control treatment is returned is if the SDK is not ready to calculate the treatment, meaning it needs to download all the split definitions and the relative segments into the client side, and then it will be ready to calculate the treatment in what we call a ready state. So we have to make sure that the SDK is in ready state before we call the getTreatment. Once we fix that, then we can do the call getTreatment again. An important part of debugging is basically enabling the debugging log. For each language, there's a special way to enable debugging log. For example, in JavaScript, we simply type in the JavaScript console, in the browser, development environment, we can put local storage.splitio_debug equal on. For Java language, we simply add .enable debug in the Split client config builder. In Ruby, we add two parameters into the options object that goes into initializing the factory. In PHP, the same thing, we add this line for the logging to the SDK config object, which usually goes into the factory initialization. Obviously, each SDK has their own way of enabling logging, and you can go to the docs.split.io and look for each SDK section to know how to enable the logs. Now here is a debugging log example for JavaScript SDK, and this is when the SDK is running fine and we're able to send a treatment successfully. First part is SDK object initialization, and we see here that SDK has fetched the relevant segment and split definition. As we can see, it says here took this much millisecond to finish, and then and we can see that it says getting ready. So this means that actually the SDK is ready now to calculate the getTreatment call. We can see here also that it's actually logging that setting the treatment to correct treatment. And we can see that it's actually showing what was the key used or client ID used in the getTreatment call. Now here we see the thread that actually posts the event successfully into Split Cloud, and of course we see the impression is being sent to Split Cloud as well successfully. Now in this log for JavaScript SDK, we can show how an issue is showing up. So in the first few lines, it's the same lines that we've seen before. The SDK object initialized started, but we do see that a getTreatment call is issued before the SDK event is ready. So we did not see that everything is ready and the segments and the split definition has been downloaded lines before we see that there's a getTreatment call, and we can see here that says split client doesn't exist. I mean, the client object is not ready yet. So here we do see that the information is downloaded from Split Cloud, and presumably this is where the SDK is ready. Now here's the same debugging log using Java SDK. As we can see, it's a little bit different, but it's the same conceptual sections that we saw in the JavaScript side. So here it initialized the config and factory object. Here we see the SDK download the split definitions and signal that it is ready. The JavaScript SDK actually shows all the details of the get, post, request, and all the HTTP response coming back. It does show the headers and the body details in its log. So the logging is much more rich than the JavaScript side. Now, after the getTreatment is called, here we do see that the call is successful and the SDK has posted the impression successfully to the Split Cloud. The Ruby SDK is kind of similar to JavaScript. We can see that it does initialize the config and factory object. Here it's very clear that it did download all the information from Split Cloud, and we can see Split IO SDK is ready line. Now after the getTreatment call, it also shows us that it did post the impression, and it's posted as well the event since here we used the client.track call. Now going back to the live impression tab, it's very simple tab, but does have all the columns or all the fields that are included in the impression. So we do have, for example, the treatment text that was calculated. It also tells us which SDK sent this impression. As we can see here, JavaScript and Android both sent impressions to this split. We also see that it logs the control treatment as well. So this is assuming that there's no connection issues between the SDK client and the Split Cloud, but the getTreatment was calculated or called before the SDK was ready. Thanks for watching. Please head to docs.split.io for all the information regarding the Split SDK. You can also head to the knowledge base section in the Split Help Center.